In this PowerPoint, I will highlight some of the important elements of chapters 1 and 2 of our course text, the chapters by Bruce Alexander's The Globalization of Addiction and Gabor Mate's In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts. First off, we need some basic concepts. Substance dependence can be broken down into psychological and physiological components. Psychological dependence refers to people's thinking related to a substance or behavior. When something becomes so central that it constantly occupies a person's thoughts, to the point that they do not think they can cope with life situations without it, then we can start to talk about psychological dependence. Physiological dependence happens at a cellular level and includes tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance occurs when the body adapts to a substance and more of the substance is needed to get the same effect. An example of this would be needing more alcohol to get feelings of relaxation after significant use. Withdrawal, on the other hand, is the opposite effect of the body trying to get back to homeostasis after a cellular adaptation has occurred. Cernick talks about this as rebounding or overshooting. You get the opposite effect of the substance in withdrawal. So in the case of a depressant like alcohol, you get the shakes and agitation. While we won't be studying the biology of the brain in any great detail, we need to be looking at the neurobiology, the study of nerve cells or neurons, and the study of neurotransmitters. Neurons are the only cells in our body that carry information. Information travels through a neuron as an electrical signal, but because the electrical signal cannot travel across a synaptic gap between two cells, the neuron uses a chemical signal, a neurotransmitter, to convey information. And this is the interesting part when it comes to substance use. While there are hundreds of neurotransmitters that we know about, we will only be looking at a few main ones in this course: norepinephrine, serotonin, gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, endomorphines, cannabinoids, acetylcholine, and the one neurotransmitter that is involved in virtually all substances of abuse. You guessed it, dopamine. Dopamine is very important because it is a key role in the reward and motivation system. Neurotransmitters are released from one neuron at the axon terminal. They cross the synaptic gap or synapse and are received by receptors. Different substances of abuse increase the release of certain neurotransmitters. Some mimic neurotransmitters, such as opioid drugs like heroin or morphine. Some interfere with the reuptake of neurotransmitters, thereby building up the concentration in the synapse. Cocaine, for example, works in this way by increasing dopamine in the synapses by preventing its reuptake. And so does SSRI antidepressants, and SSRI being selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, purposefully preventing the reuptake of serotonin in drugs such as Prozac and Paxil antidepressants, which allow for more serotonin to build up in the synaptic space. Moving on to theoretical models. According to Cernick, a theoretical model should explain how and why people start taking substances, continue to take substances, escalate in their substance use, stop using substances, and relapse into taking substances again, therefore starting the cycle over. At this point, no one theory is successful at this task, and instead of siding with one theory or another, I invite you to see the strengths and weaknesses of each, understanding the evidence, assessing them from their practical and ethical perspectives, and most importantly, seeing how they might fit together to paint an elaborate and complex picture of addictive behaviors. Important at this point is for you to kind of locate yourself within this very complex tapestry of theories. Why do you believe the things you do at this point? While the practice and research fields are moving away from a moral view of substances, the idea that drug use is wrong, sinful, or a personal failing is still very widely held in North America. The moral view lacks research support, and programs like Just Say No and DARE have shown very poor success rates in stopping substance use. One important aspect is that while we're trying to educate young people, it's important to keep in mind the history of misinformation that has been espoused by some programs, and that we are slowly moving towards factual, evidence-based information provided at an age-appropriate way. Similarly, the medical model, which theorizes addiction as a chronic disease, has almost not borne any research literature in its favor. The disease model also founds things like Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, which is an approach to treatment that millions of people find useful. There have been some findings that brain of addicted and non-addictive people are different. However, such differences can be the result of biology or of sustained substance use. Genetic theories, which use twin studies, family histories, and look at ethnic and cultural differences, have shown some promising results, but a specific gene for addictions has not yet been found. Genetic theory has more recently evolved into epigenetics, something we'll be focusing on throughout this course. Epigenetics is the study how the environment and experience can switch particular genes on and off. This is probably the most exciting and fruitful area of study currently. When we look at personality, we find a list of factors from high emotionality and low frustration tolerance to poor self-esteem and anxiety issues correlated with substance dependence. Correlation, remember, does not equal cause, as early life experiences and social factors can contribute to both emotionality and addictive behaviors. From a humanistic perspective, we could look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and see how substance use can be a compensation for frustrations of not achieving movement in our journey to self-actualization. Learning theory attempts to look at behaviors as sedimented into habituations through positive-negative feedback. Positive-negative reinforcement provided by families, friends, and society more generally will, from this perspective, increase or decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Here we are looking at social responses in terms of punishment and reward, as well as the subjective feelings of pleasure and discomfort. Social theories attempt to explain substance use through socialization processes and cultural norms. One trend finding from this area is that cultures with the lowest harms from alcohol usually have clear and uniform rules prohibiting the use of alcohol, with some specific and culturally sanctioned opportunities for use. We are, however, just at the beginning stages of learning about the long-term impacts of decriminalization, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of longitudinal findings we have for countries such as Portugal and Netherlands, where many substances of abuse are decriminalized. Other facets of sociological analyses are the availability of substances, including an analysis of their cost, and the production and distribution of illicit substances on the global market related to poverty of countries and lack of other industry. Bruce Alexander specifically looks at cultural and historical facts. His pioneering work was actually in addictions, but he was frustrated by the limited success he and his peers had in stemming the rising tide of addictive behaviors in modern society. Alexander instead then takes a look at addictions, leaving the realm of individual pathology and surveying changing rates of addiction across time and culture. He finds specifically that, quote, a society structured around free market economics generates enormous material wealth and technical innovation, and, at the same time, breaks down every traditional form of social cohesion and belief, creating a loss of dislocation of poverty of the spirit that draws people into addiction and other psychological problems. He defines dislocation as a state of, quote, being torn from the close ties of family, culture, and traditional spirituality that constituted the normal fabric of life in pre-modern times. He uses Vancouver as his prime example of a wealthy and vibrant city with an excruciating amount of suffering due to addictions of various kinds. In his first and 10th chapter, he details various ethnic, indigenous, religious, racial, and ideological experiences related to beliefs, culture, and addiction. Many people, including myself, are taken aback by some of the ways and what he has to say. One thing I cannot argue with, however, is that no account of the contemporary experience of addiction can be considered without at least the consideration of how capitalism has fragmented ways of life and has sustained groups of people for millennia. I have opened a discussion forum for anyone who would like to voice any concerns, criticisms, or supporting thoughts to Alexander's theses. Turning now to Gabor Mate. Writing as a doctor, Gabor explicitly challenges the monopoly of the disease model for describing and attributing causes for addiction. He explicitly omits the word disease from his definition of addiction and instead characterizes it in terms of compulsion, impaired control, persistence, irritability, relapse, and craving. He further critiques the medical establishment on 3 grounds: the mind-body dualism, minimizing or ignoring the role of environment, and not studying normal human psychology and emotional development. In some ways, CYC practitioners, although usually less savvy about brain science and biology, have a leg up on psychologists in other important areas of addictive behaviors. Specifically, CYC's emphasis on early relationships, ecological systems, and development position us to hear Mate's perspective openly, unlike those in the anecdotes that begin chapter 17 of his book. Mate argues that, quote, the expression of genetic potential is, for the most part, contingent on the environment, end quote. And he goes on to detail how brains of humans, more than any other mammal, develop after birth due to evolutionary necessity. While he notes the tremendous importance of in utero development in other places in his book, chapter 17 explains how, quote, there are times in the first years of life when, every second, multiple millions of nerve connections or synapses are established, end quote. Not only are new brain connections made, innumerable connections are also pruned to prepare the infant for its greatest chances of success through adaptation. It is precisely in this adaptive journey that the foundations of later addiction can set in, both as the result of negative experiences and insufficient positive experiences. Mate argues that the emotional environment constituted by nurturing adults is vital in the setting the blueprint for later life. His requisites for healthy development are nutrition, physical security, and emotional nurturing. Mate spends the whole of chapter 18 detailing how the primary biological systems implicated in addiction can be adversely affected in the early years, leading to long-term impairments in functioning in major developmental areas of the brain and body, such as the opioid attachment reward system, the dopamine-based incentive motivation system, limbic system or the emotional brain, self-regulation areas in the prefrontal cortex, and the stress response system. Mate argues that hardcore addicts, quote, never had a chance, end quote, due to early trauma, neglect, or severe stress. He later resolves these insights are precisely what is needed in contemporary addictions treatment. In the final chapters of his book, he details a therapeutic model based in neurobiology and attachment theory, and ends his book on a note of self-reflection and authenticity that any CYC practitioner can appreciate. He says, quote, when we know ourselves, then you will be known.